Everything starts with the original Duttons, the foundation of this entire story, seen in 1883 and 1923. James and Margaret Dutton are the ones who first bring the family west, chasing a future they can barely imagine. They don't arrive with power or comfort, they arrive with loss, survival, and a dangerous journey that reshapes their entire bloodline. Their children become the center of everything that comes after, especially Elsa, whose choice of land becomes the very heart of the Yellowstone Ranch. That decision alone ties every future generation to one specific place, one piece of land that becomes more than property. It becomes legacy. But from the very beginning, tragedy defines this family more than success ever does. James dies. Margaret dies. And the children are left scattered under the care of Jacob and Cara Dutton, who step in as the backbone of the family. This is where the Dutton name starts to shift from just a family, into something more like a responsibility that nobody can escape. Jacob and Cara don't just raise children, they raise the future of an empire that hasn't even been built yet. And even though they have no biological heirs of their own, they become the glue holding everything together during some of the harshest years in American history. Then comes the confusion that fans still debate today. The children of this generation are not just one simple line forward. They branch, overlap, and repeat names in a way that makes tracking them feel almost impossible. John appears again and again. So does the idea of inheritance. But the timeline doesn't always move cleanly. Some characters die young. Some disappear from the story entirely. And some leave behind children whose futures are never fully explained. And that's where the first cracks in the family tree begin to show. Because if the foundation is already this complicated, what happens when the next generations start stacking on top of it? That's where things stop making sense, and the real confusion begins. After the first generation sets the foundation, the story shifts into the second generation, where things start to get even more emotional and honestly, more confusing. This is where we meet the younger versions of the Dutton legacy, characters like Elsa, John, Spencer, and the people who carry the name forward in ways that don't always feel consistent. Elsa Dutton stands out immediately, not just because of her journey, but because she is the emotional center of 1883. She doesn't just travel west with her family, she defines where the family will stay forever. Her death isn't just tragic, it becomes symbolic. The land she chooses becomes the future Yellowstone Ranch, meaning every generation after her is connected to her decision, whether they realize it or not. Then comes John Dutton from this era, a character who creates one of the earliest repeating patterns in the family tree. The name John doesn't just appear once in this universe, it keeps returning across generations, almost like a cycle that never fully breaks. This is where viewers start noticing something strange. The timeline doesn't feel linear anymore. It feels like the same names are being reused in different generations, making it harder to understand who belongs where. Spencer Dutton adds another layer to this confusion. His story, especially in 1923, introduces distance, separation, and survival across continents. But the real complication begins with his children and relationships. Spencer and Alex's storyline becomes one of the most emotionally intense parts of the entire saga, but also one of the most important for the family tree. Their child, another John, is where the naming pattern repeats again. And this is where the problem starts to grow: multiple Johns, multiple generations, and not enough clarity about how they connect in the official timeline. At the same time, tragedy continues to cut through the family line. Some characters die before fully building their branch of the tree. Others leave behind children whose futures are unclear or never fully shown on screen. This creates gaps, missing pieces in the timeline that fans are constantly trying to fill with theories. Because if one generation disappears too early, it raises a bigger question: who carries the name forward? And just when it feels like things might start making sense, the third generation enters the story, and the confusion doesn't slow down, it actually gets worse. The third generation is where the Dutton family tree starts to feel like it's breaking its own rules. This is the point where names repeat, timelines overlap, and character connections stop feeling straightforward. Jack Dutton becomes a key figure here, carrying the family line forward, but even his story doesn't follow a clean path. His marriage, his future child, and his early death all create gaps in the timeline that are never fully explained. And those gaps are exactly what make the entire family tree feel unstable. Elizabeth Dutton's storyline adds even more uncertainty. Her pregnancy becomes one of those unresolved threads that fans still debate. Did the child survive? Did that line continue properly? The show never fully confirms it, and that silence creates space for theories. Because in a family tree like this, missing answers don't stay missing, they turn into speculation. And speculation becomes part of the fandom's understanding of the timeline. Then there's Spencer's line again, and this is where the confusion really deepens. Spencer and Alex's child named John creates what seems like a direct continuation, but the generation labeling doesn't match up cleanly with what fans expect. This is where the idea of a fourth generation becomes a major mystery. If Spencer's child exists and Elizabeth's child exists, and both lines continue separately or merge later, then the numbering of generations stops feeling logical. And that's where the biggest question appears: how can John Dutton from the main Yellowstone timeline be labeled as a later generation when earlier Johns already exist? This is the exact contradiction that keeps fans debating. Some believe there are missing branches, entire parts of the family that were never shown on screen. Others think the timeline is intentionally structured to hide certain connections until future spin-offs reveal them. But right now, nothing is confirmed. Instead, what we have is a fractured tree, branches that don't line up cleanly, names that repeat across decades, and generations that feel like they may have been skipped entirely. And this is exactly where the theory of a missing fourth generation comes from. Because when a family tree stops making sense, fans don't stop looking. They start rebuilding it themselves. This is where the biggest mystery of the entire Yellowstone family tree begins: the missing fourth generation. Because once you lay out all the known Duttons, there's an uncomfortable gap that nobody can clearly explain. If Spencer's son John exists and Elizabeth's child also exists, then logically there should be a complete generation sitting between the early 1920s timeline and the modern-day Duttons. But when fans map it out, something feels off. Either that generation is being overlooked, or it hasn't fully been revealed yet. This is why so many theories started forming around hidden children, unnamed heirs, and forgotten branches of the family. Spencer's line, in particular, raises questions. If his son survives and continues the bloodline, then that branch should directly connect to the modern Yellowstone era. But if that child doesn't survive, the entire structure shifts again, leaving space for another possible heir from Elizabeth and Jack's side. And that's where the theory becomes even more complicated, because now there isn't just one missing piece, there are multiple possibilities for how the line could continue. Some fans believe the fourth generation isn't missing at all, it's just split. One branch may come from Spencer's descendants, while another may come from Elizabeth's unborn child. If both lines continue separately for decades before merging again, it could explain why the modern Dutton family tree feels so tangled. It would also explain why names like John keep repeating in different eras, almost like the family is trying to preserve identity through naming patterns rather than clear generational structure. But there's another theory that's even more controversial. Some believe the timeline itself is not strictly linear. That means certain spin-offs might not follow a perfectly chronological order, which could explain why generations feel misaligned. If that's true, then what looks like a missing generation might actually be hidden within future stories, like 1944 or other upcoming expansions of the Yellowstone universe. And that uncertainty is exactly what keeps the debate alive. Because every time fans think they've solved the family tree, another detail appears that breaks the logic again. And now, as we move closer to the modern Duttons, the confusion doesn't end, it only becomes more intense. By the time we reach the modern Duttons, everything from the past generations starts colliding into one complicated web of names, choices, and consequences. This is the family most viewers know best: John Dutton, Beth, Jamie, Case, and Tate, but even here, the cracks in the family tree are impossible to ignore. John Dutton stands at the center of it all, representing what the entire bloodline has been building toward for generations. But even his position raises questions, because depending on how you trace the lineage, his exact placement in the generational structure doesn't line up cleanly with what came before. Beth Dutton, Case Dutton, and Jamie Dutton each represent different directions the family could have taken. Beth carries the intensity and survival instinct that feels deeply rooted in the Dutton legacy. Case represents distance from the family, but still ends up tied to the land in ways he can't escape. Jamie, despite being adopted, complicates the idea of what it even means to be a real Dutton, because bloodline and identity don't always match in this story. And then there's Tate, who represents the future, but also the pressure of inheriting something built across generations of violence, sacrifice, and survival. But even in this modern era, the missing fourth-generation theory still casts a shadow. Because if the earlier timeline truly has gaps, then the modern family tree might not be as clean as it appears. It raises the possibility that what we see in Yellowstone is only the final layer of a much larger structure, one that includes lost branches, hidden descendants, or even unexplored connections that will only be revealed in future spin-offs. And that's what keeps this entire universe alive. The Dutton family tree isn't just a history, it's an ongoing mystery. Every generation adds answers but also creates new questions. Every spin-off fills in one gap, while creating two more. And even now in 2026, the biggest question still hasn't been fully answered. Where exactly does every Dutton truly belong in this timeline? Because until every missing piece is revealed, the Dutton family tree will never feel complete.